Hello, everyone. My name's Alex Schadenberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, and we're going to be talking today about an update on assisted suicide initiatives, laws, what's going on in the U.S. and America. We've got Gordon Friesen, our president, with us, and a group of people. So this is wonderful to have you together. The event is being recorded and will be shared in the very near future. And I'm just going to begin by saying thank you for joining us. And it's going to be approximately an hour, and near the end, there'll be lots of time for questions. So I'm going to get right into the presentation. I'm not going to waste time. And so basically, the theme of the whole issue is an update on assisted suicide. And somehow, here we go, it'll go like this. And we're going to go like that. Very good. So I have to make sure I can let in our participants. There we go. Very good. So the assisted suicide lobby, we all know that they're quite relentless and they're well funded. We also know that they have a long-term strategy. This is not a short-term strategy for them. They're working state by state, etc. They're working on changing language. That's a lot of people aren't realizing, not only changing language, but changing the meaning of the language they're using already. One of the most effective ways to expand assisted suicide is change the meaning of what the law actually says. They're pretty relentless and they're strategic. We need to be relentless, strategic, and caring. We cannot stop. We cannot be in a situation where we allow them to take more control. We must be in a battle to prevent killing. And I use this word killing on purpose because a lot of people are afraid to use it. I'm not afraid to use the word because that's what this is about. We must be knowledgeable and we must be compassionate at all times. We must use effective language. I keep telling people one of the most effective things we can do is calling assisted suicide, and if it's euthanasia, call it what it is. It's very important. So there are 10 states and one jurisdiction that have legalized assisted suicide in America. I'm not going to go through that with you. At the moment, the past 3 years, no new state has legalized assisted suicide. So this has been a great victory. The assisted suicide lobby has tried very hard to legalize. Last year, they had approximately 20 states where they had bills. Last year, Colorado did expand their assisted suicide law, so you can see where they're going. In 2023, Nevada did pass an assisted suicide bill, and in 2024, Delaware passed an assisted suicide bill, but both bills were vetoed. West Virginia passed Amendment 1 to prevent euthanasia and assisted suicide in their constitution. So we see this is a great victory in West Virginia, and that means it's probably impossible ever to legalize assisted suicide in West Virginia. But it's important to say that no new state legalized assisted suicide in 2024. I already said the last 3 years there have been no new states. This has been a massive victory. Some people may not realize how big a victory that is if you consider the amount of money and investment the assisted suicide lobby has put into legalizing assisted suicide and have failed. I think that's just a massive point to show that this is not what people want you to believe. They want people to believe that there's just a massive push towards legalizing assisted suicide. That's like a tidal wave. And in fact, that's not the case at all. You should also know that in 2024, the New Hampshire State House did pass the assisted suicide bill, but the Senate referred it to a study by a vote of 17-7. So you see that they've had success in some places, but they haven't gotten anything through. So my concern, a big concern, is in 2024, Delaware passed the assisted suicide bill by a vote of 21-16 in the House, 4 abstained, and the vote was 11-10 in the Senate. The bill was vetoed by Governor Carney. So obviously our big concern about Delaware, and it's a massive concern, is Governor Carney is not there anymore, and the new governor has said he supports assisted suicide. I think there's some things that we can do that were done very well in 2024 that should be done in more states. One of them is this Indiana resolution. So they had a resolution HCR 0019 and SCR 0017 in Indiana last year, and I thought it was a fabulously written resolution. And I think these are the kind of things that we can do very well in many states, that in order to prevent or make it more difficult for the state ever to consider assisted suicide. So the vote was 39-9 with one no vote and one abstention in the Indiana Senate on this resolution, and it's strongly condemned assisted suicide. This could be replicated in what I call pro-life states or conservative states in America. What did it say? I'm just going to go through it very quickly. It's easy to find. You can go to my blog and just go to the topic Indiana and find it also. Or you can link to it by just taking the name of it. You know, it was SCR0017. The Indiana General Assembly, in its unqualified interest in preserving human life, strongly opposes and condemns physician-assisted suicide. That the Indiana General Assembly strongly opposes physician-assisted suicide because anything less than a prohibition leads to foreseeable abuses and eventually to euthanasia by devaluing human life, particularly the lives of the terminally ill, elderly, disabled, and depressed, whose lives are of no less value or quality than any other citizen of the state. Section 3 said that the Indiana General Assembly strongly opposes physician-assisted suicide even for terminally ill, mentally competent adults because assisted suicide eviscerates efforts to prevent the self-destruction act of suicide and hinders progress in effective physician interventions, including diagnosis, treating of depression, managing pain, providing palliative and hospice care. Section 4 said that the Indiana General Assembly strongly opposes physician suicide because assisted suicide undermines the integrity and ethics of the medical profession, subverts a physician's role as healer, and compromises the physician-patient relationship. I'm of the opinion that the Indiana resolution could be replicated in many, many, many states. It did not, it passed in the, yeah, here we go. It had passed in the Senate, but was not debated in the House, and that could be because of timing. I'm not sure exactly, but nonetheless, I thought it was very well written and made a lot of sense and could pass in many, many, many states. Now, West Virginia Amendment 1. So the Amendment 1 in West Virginia was a very, very, very close vote. So what you have is a situation where this was an amendment to the State Bill of Rights, and it would make euthanasia or assisted suicide completely prohibited in those states. As you can see, there's some people joining us, so I'm going to make sure they can come in. 1 second here. Okay, there we go. And so this amendment was actually a bit controversial because it was a bit of a challenge to get an amendment passed in the State Bill of Rights. As I said, it passed by 50.5% to 49.5%, very, very close. The supporter of the bill was someone who had done very, very well in the previous election, actually had no challenge in this election. So he had lots of time to work on this. I thought his talking points were excellent. But what it said was no physician or healthcare provider in the state of West Virginia shall participate in the practice of medically assisted suicide, euthanasia, or mercy killing. Nothing in this section prohibits the administration or prescription of medication for the purpose of alleviating pain or discomfort, nor does anything in this section prohibit the withholding or withdrawing of life-sustaining treatment as requested by the patient or the patient's decision maker. And there was a little bit more to it than that. This was something that would be very difficult to pass in most states, but was passed in West Virginia, and I considered it an incredible victory. But we have a lot to learn with the talking points, because in West Virginia, the main talking points were, we will not do this in West Virginia, and it described assisted suicide as abandoning people in their time of need. And I thought they did an excellent job of maintaining their talking points. West Virginia is a bit of a unique state because of the dynamics of that state. Nonetheless, it could be possible to pass something like this in a few other states, but only probably a few other states. So in 2025, there are currently 15 states who have introduced assisted suicide bills. So the assisted suicide law, again, is relentless. Many of these states have had bills before, and many of these states, why would they introduce an assisted suicide bill in a state that clearly it's never going to pass in that state? We're very concerned this year, though, about Delaware, Illinois, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and New York. And I think there might be other states that we should be very concerned about also, but those in particular we're very concerned about. And these are states that, so for instance, Delaware, as you know, passed their assisted suicide bill last year, and it was vetoed. And the assisted suicide lobby is pretty sure they're going to win this year. We have to make sure they do not win. Remember, in the Senate, Delaware passed that assisted suicide bill by one vote. It might take one vote. I'm not sure exactly how the Senate sits right now, but nonetheless, we need to make sure that there's at least one vote going the other direction in 2025. Illinois has not had votes on assisted suicide in the past, but it's a state that has had a bill in the past. Massachusetts they've been pushing Massachusetts for a very long time for assisted suicide. Rhode Island has had bills before. As you know, New Hampshire last year passed it in the House, but it died in the Senate, so I'm sure they're pushing again. And when you're looking at New York, New York's a place where they've been pushing assisted suicide for a very long time and have not had any success yet. The concern about Delaware, of course, is that this new governor supports assisted suicide, so we've got a lot to be concerned about. What is a great victory coming before us is New Mexico. New Mexico has a bill to prohibit assisted suicide. Now, they've had this bill come forward, or very similar versions of this bill come forward every 2 years. So the New Mexico legislature operates on a every 2-year cycle. So therefore, this year, they will be sitting for about 40 days and in 2025. In 2023, the same sorry, not New Mexico, it's not New Mexico, it is Montana. I'm sorry. It's Montana that has the bill to make assisted suicide illegal. So in 2023, Montana had the same bill, and in 2023, it lost by one vote. On February 7th, the Montana Senate voted 29-20 to pass SB 136. So this is a very good story for us. It's hopefully going to pass in the House. It's right now in the House. It's in a committee to be debated. So what happened in Montana? In 2009, the Baxter Court decision declared that Montana has the right to assisted suicide. That was a lower court decision. The Baxter decision was appealed to the Montana Supreme Court, where they decided that there was no right to assisted suicide. In fact, they did not strike down the assisted suicide law either, but the court found what they called a defense of consent. So that means in Montana, a physician who assisted suicide must prove that there was consent. This bill, Bill 136, will remove the defense of consent from the Montana law. So it would make that a non-issue and once again make assisted suicide illegal in Montana. So that's very important for us that this happens in Montana. So what does the assisted suicide lobby plan to do? Well, this is where they've been pushing. You can tell what they're doing. They're trying to legalize assisted suicide in more states. This year, they're working on 15 new states. At the moment, there could be a few more yet. Where assisted suicide is legal, they're trying to expand those laws. So currently, there is 6 states that they're trying to expand the laws in 2025. They're trying to eliminate the waiting periods. So you can see that in the theme of the states where they're trying to expand the laws. They're eliminating the waiting periods. Their goal is a same-day death. They also want shorter waiting periods for the issue of VSCD. That is people dying by dehydration. What happens in the assisted suicide lobby if you're told that you're not terminally ill, you don't qualify? If you stop eating and drinking, suddenly you become terminally ill. They want to expand who can do assisted suicide. So you see in these states, they're adding nurse practitioners, doctor assistants to the list of killers. And we're going to go through that in a section. One of the reasons for this is that they would say there's too few doctors willing to do assisted suicide. Now, they wouldn't say it that way, but certainly that's how I would express it. Their problem is with assisted suicide is that they have too few providers of assisted suicide. So therefore, they would say by expanding the providers, they'll expand their access to assisted suicide. They're trying to eliminate the residency requirement. So Oregon and Vermont have already eliminated the residency requirement. So it means that anybody by assisted suicide. They're trying to allow deaths by lethal injection. So they're trying to add euthanasia to the option. And the reason is well, you know, I shouldn't say this, but it's sort of true. Assisted suicide is less successful at killing than euthanasia is. Let's just put it that way. The fact of it is euthanasia is a form of homicide. because euthanasia requires the doctor to actually do the act, whereas assisted suicide is assisting a suicide, whereby the doctor doesn't actually do the act, but they prescribe the lethal drugs. Now, I'm going to get into this sort of issue with California and Oregon, etc., why those are concerning expansion bills. They're trying to permit assisted suicide by telehealth, because that enables approval by assisted suicide in places where there's no doctor or provider willing to do it, and or where it's not legal. So, for instance, in Oregon, where you have assisted suicide where there's no residency requirement, or in Vermont there's no residency requirement, that if you have assisted suicide by telehealth, they can do approvals ahead of time to out-of-state residents, for instance. In the case of some states, they have no person who provides assisted suicide in some regions of that state. Therefore, they want assisted suicide approvals by telehealth in order to make access easier. They wanted to define assisted suicide as a form of medical treatment. This is fundamental to their goal. They keep calling it medical treatment. Now, why is this? Well, first of all, they want it to be allowed for chronic conditions and rather than terminal conditions. So if it's a medical treatment, they can apply it to a wider group of people. But secondly, if it's medical treatment, then there's this whole concept that you must offer it to people. If it's actually a medical treatment, when you're going to a doctor and you have a medical condition, doctors are somewhat obligated to offer you the options that are available to you. So you understand that if it becomes a medical treatment, it becomes offered to you also because it's an option for you if you define it as medical treatment. They want to establish regional assisted suicide centers with no residency requirements. You already actually have that in Oregon. Dr. Gideon is doing assisted suicide for people who are out of state. They want to pass this federal legislation such as Patients End of Life Care Act that includes then assisted suicide. So in 2024, SB 1196 would have expanded the California law by allowing IV intravenous application for the lethal drugs. So this is identical to Canada's euthanasia law. Now, they were saying this would be for assisted suicide, but what were they trying to do? And I'll go on with this further because they have a new bill in 2025. But what were they trying to do? They're trying to define death by using IV drug, inserting it by IV, as being assisted suicide. But what happens then is it becomes indistinguishable from euthanasia. Remember how this is done. The doctor prescribes to you the lethal poison drugs. Now, if the doctor puts it in you, that becomes euthanasia. But if you push the button, that would be technically assisted suicide, meaning you push a button once the IV is all set up. But how would anybody know? Because here's the point. None of these laws require oversight at the death. None of them do. How would you actually know that it was an assisted suicide or euthanasia? There's no way to know. It would be impossible to know. So if you allow assisted suicide to be done by intravenous, then obviously speaking, you would be allowing euthanasia because there is no oversight. There is nothing in the law to require oversight. They wanted to remove the 6-month prognosis and replace it with the Canadian definition, which is grievous and irremediable medical condition. What is a grievous and irremediable medical condition? Anybody who has a disability would fit the definition of a grievous and irremediable medical condition. They were wanting to allow people with early stage dementia to qualify to be killed, and they wanted to remove the California residency requirement. Now, SB 1196 was dropped. So you hear the assisted suicide lobby people saying, well, this shows you that, there's controls over these issues and everything. And really, in fact, that's not the case at all. The reason Compassionate Choices opposed SB 1196 is not because they oppose the concept of it. Remember, this is the same group that's constantly talking about how they think that the Canadian situation is wonderful. The Canadian situation is euthanasia. It's not assisted suicide. The Canadian situation, when you're using IV, it's euthanasia. The doctor's administering it. So if they keep lauding the Canadian situation is so wonderful, why would they be opposed to SB 1196? And the reason is obvious. It's because it would have made it harder for them, and obviously it did make it harder for them to pass other assisted suicide laws. If California allows for this, then it would be harder to get it passed in Delaware, Massachusetts, et cetera, New York, et cetera. You name the states. The argument that this is just for terminally ill people. This is just going to be, self-administered. It's harder to make. Currently, 6 states have bills to expand their assisted suicide laws. So California, Maine, New Jersey, Oregon, Vermont, Washington State. So California is going at it again. So SB 403 is currently a placeholder bill. So if you Google SB 403, you'll notice that there's no language to that bill. It's just a placeholder right now. But Thaddeus Pope, and Thaddeus Pope is a pretty active euthanasia assisted suicide leader, professor. And if Thaddeus Pope says that the bill is going to expand who can approve assisted suicide, and it's going to eliminate the 6-month terminal illness prognosis, and they're going to use serious irreversible illnesses as the definition. They want to eliminate the California residency requirement, and they want to permit assisted suicide by IV. I think that's probably the direction they're going. Now, during the Zoom event that occurred, where Senator Blakespear, who's the promoter of the bill, the sponsor of the bill, she was very much also focusing on the whole issue of dementia. So something tells me that 403, when the word comes out, is probably going to also have that in it in the same way as SB 1196 did. So the main bill will allow physicians to waive the waiting period. So the main bill is more simple than most of these assisted suicide expansion bills. My point is sort of obvious. If they're that close to death, why do you have to be involved with killing them? They're going to die a natural death. Just take care of their pain and symptoms and allow them to die a natural death. The New Jersey bill allows the physician to waive the 15-day waiting period, but it does maintain the 48-hour waiting period between the requests. So the New Jersey bill is more interesting that way. The Oregon bill expands who can do assisted suicide. So they, once again, it looks at nurse practitioners, physician assistants, etc. And then it reduces the waiting period from 15 days to 48 hours. Now that 15-day waiting period already had a waive provision in it, but if they reduce it to 48 hours and then they allow the provider to waive the waiting period. Now I use the word provider because if they expand it to include non-physicians, their new definition for who can do assisted suicide is a provider rather than a physician. And as I say, the language may also allow euthanasia. So the bill was quite interesting in its nature because the language they're using is not that the person would self-administer, but the person may self-administer. The whole concept then is, well, maybe they don't then, maybe someone else does it. It becomes a whole question about, does this language actually lead into euthanasia or not? And so the Oregon Medical Association pointed out that this bill appears to possibly allow for euthanasia. And I think that the Oregon Medical Association is probably correct on this. The Washington State bill expands who can approve assisted suicide, once again, physician assistants, etc. And it allows the medical provider to waive the 7-day waiting period. So you see this, and the Vermont bill would allow non-physicians to approve assisted suicide. So you see where they're going. They want to waive the waiting periods. They want to allow non-physicians to do it. They're trying to change the language of the legislation. You can see everything I pointed out where they're going as where they're at, what they're actually doing with this legislation. Most assisted suicide bills are Trojan horse bills, not all of them. Some of them are actually pretty out and out, extreme. So for instance, the Nevada bill is pretty much an assisted suicide bill that's on steroids. I was reading the Nevada bill, and I haven't put up an article about it yet, but it doesn't have a 6-month provision in it. So it says terminal illness, but it doesn't define terminal illness, etc. So, right off the bat, when you start reading the Nevada bill, you realize it's more of an expanded nature bill. Now, what do I mean by these bills are Trojan horse bills? Well, the purpose of the bill is to legalize assisted suicide. So if it doesn't matter what state it's in, the idea of the bill is that we will do what we can to convince legislators to pass the bill. And once the bill is passed, we're going to expand the law. That's exactly their goal, and that's where they're going. Because once the state has legalized assisted suicide, they know that it's easier to expand the law later. It's harder to legalize assisted suicide than expanding it later. Okay, so once the states legalize assisted suicide, compassionate choices, who appear to be like you're the friendly person to the assisted suicide supporters in that state, they in fact have also been launching court cases. So you see this in Oregon, you saw this in Vermont, you saw this in New Jersey, where they're launching court cases to expand the law. So who was the assisted suicide lobby state friend suddenly becomes their enemy as they pressure those states to expand their laws. they pressure them to the courts also. Some states have more expansive bills. I point out that you saw my typo earlier about New Mexico, and of course it was Montana. New Mexico, for instance, when they passed their law originally, that was an assisted suicide bill on steroids. Obviously speaking, there's less demand to expand a law that's already been expanded from the beginning than a law that started out a little bit tighter. Just you see some of these comments. J.M. Sorrell, Executive Director of Massachusetts Death with Dignity, he said on a bill, once you get something passed, you can always work on amendments later. So he was actually reacting to his own people who were suggesting that the Massachusetts bill wasn't wide enough, and he said that we first have to get it passed. Amy Powlin, sponsor for the New York bill, she stated at an event promoting the bill, we've been criticized by some organizations that actually want an expansion, but we've held firm because we want to get this passed first. You see what they're saying? We want to expand the bill first. You know, Josh Elliott. And now Connecticut's actually had a problem in the last few years. They had a bill every year for 11 years straight, and every year that bill got defeated. Josh Elliott was in the paper in 2024, sort of in an interview saying he wanted it heavily. My internet connection is unstable. I'm sorry about this. He wanted a heavily safeguarded bill. And he said, then we can get it passed. And he said, then we can have amendments later. So obviously, Josh Elliott was being very straightforward about what his goals were. And I think that's probably why he's had problems with getting a bill passed in the last 2 years. Oregon data. I think it's important. A lot of people look closely at this data. In 2023, it said there was 367 reported assisted suicide deaths. Now, first of all, I'm going to go into it in my next slide. I think that there was probably closer to 400, but I wouldn't know yet until the 2024 data comes out. And you'll see this why in a second. The assisted suicide deaths that were up by 21% from 304 in 2022. There was 566 lethal prescriptions written, which was up by 29% from 433 in 2022. Now, right off the bat, you're going to get this argument from the other side always. They say, well, you know, about 2/3 of the people die by assisted suicide, and the other 1/3, it was just a security blanket, an insurance policy for them to have the assisted suicide pills by their bedside. And in fact, that's not true. It was never true. If you look at the data, that has never been true. But because the data shows this number between prescriptions and actual deaths, you would think there might be some truth to that. I'm going to go into that in a second, right now. So in 2023, the data shows there was 141 people who received a lethal poison and died, but whose ingestion status was unknown. Now, right off the bat, I said to you about the 367 numbers being probably under what the final number will end up being when they show you the 2024 data. And the reason is some of those 141 people died by assisted suicide, but the report came in late. Okay, the report came in late. It does not show up in the 2023 report. 23 of the assisted suicide deaths in 2023 were out-of-state deaths in Oregon. I've already pointed out that Oregon has removed their residency requirement. So I think it's important to point out this whole thing about 141 people. They know they received the lethal drugs. They know they have died. They just don't know how they died when the report came out in 2023. The 2023 Oregon Assisted Suicide Report updated the 2022 data. This happens every year. You can just look at it. When you look at the 2021 report, you'll notice it updated the 2020 data. So every year you have some late reporting that went on. So the 2023 report said that there was 304 reported assisted suicide deaths in 2022. The 2022 report had said there was 278. So that update was a difference of 26. So what that means is that in 2023, 26 of the deaths, the report came, when they updated it in 2023, they're saying 26 of the deaths from 2022, the report came in late. So right off the bat, when you looked at that data, it was actually 304. So you can understand what I'm saying. When you look at 367, there's a very good chance it's actually pretty close to 400. But we haven't seen the data yet. But this is part of what happens in Oregon with the late reporting. Now, I'm going to be brutally honest with you. That report, the 2023 report, came out in March, around this time. March 10th is right now, around March 10th or so of 2024. Around this time. So the law requires those reports to be sent in within 30 days. So obviously speaking, some reports are coming out way after that 30-day limit, and that's, Oregon could deal with that fact. But you would not expect there to be too many late reports when the report is actually coming out at this time. Okay. So I'm predicting there was about 400 assisted suicide deaths in 2020, in 2024. And you'll see this number come out pretty soon in the 2024 report, in 2023 when the 2024 report comes out. Sorry. Complications. This is a very important factor because I was recently speaking at the Parliament in the UK at Westminster, and they've been told that there's almost no complications. That what are you worried about? The complication rate is tiny. Because it says for instance, in the 2023 report, there was 10 known complications. So if you're thinking 10 out of 367, that's not very much, is it? That says 7 known complications in 2022. If you're thinking 7 out of 304, you'd be thinking, well, that's not so many, right? But actually, complications are only recorded when the doctor is at the death. So when you look at the 2023 Oregon data, the doctor was only at the death 102 times. So they've got 102 reports. They've got 102 reports showing that there's 10 complications out of 102. So that's a 10% complication rate. So if you start doing the math and you realize there was likely about 400 total deaths, there was likely close to 40 complications. And that would actually fare out fairly evenly because in 2022, there were 76 reports. And of those 76 reports, 7 of them had a known complication. So that's a 9% complication rate. So it's pretty even, around 10%, 9%. So the complication rate's actually much higher. The numbers are actually much higher than you actually see in the reporting because it's based not on the number of assisted suicide deaths, it's based on the number of times. You can't get a complication report if nobody was there at the death to witness it. So if you've got 102 times where the doctor's at the death who's witnessing that death, then you get 102 reports submitted. There might have actually been more times where the doctor was at the death and no report came in. That's possible. It's possible because remember, there's no oversight of these laws. Well, the other question is, why is this important? Oregon's the only state that I see this complication issue showing up in the data. So if you start looking at places like the UK, where the population of that country is like pretty large, and if they legalize assisted suicide in England and Wales, you're talking about a fair number of people. In the end, you're going to get a huge number of assisted suicide deaths. If you start thinking about an approximate 9 or 10% complication rate, you're talking huge numbers. It's not a minor issue. Not to say it's minor in Oregon either. In 2023, California assisted suicide report stated 884 reported assisted suicide deaths. 1,281 lethal poison prescriptions were written. So once again, you get this 2/3 issue. They're going to say to you, well, about 1/3 of the people, they only have the assisted suicide drugs, poison beside their bed to make them feel comfortable. So they have it in case things get really bad. But in fact, that's not the case. It's not the case. The other thing is you see in 2023, again, this number, 276 deaths, the ingestion status was unknown. Now, once again, you get this late reporting issue in California as you do in Oregon. So some of those 276 deaths were assisted suicide deaths and there's late reporting. I would also say that there is possibly some underreporting going on. The problem is there's been no study. There's been no university doctoral student who has sought the data in order to do some study to find out how many of the deaths that were unknown were actually assisted suicide deaths that were simply not reported. That study has never been done, and therefore I can't say. I don't have any idea, but it's very likely that there are some unreported assisted suicide deaths. Now, what's interesting about the data is who died by assisted suicide, and I don't think this is something that is unimportant. But if you look at it, 87.6% of the assisted suicide deaths, the person was white in California. Now, what is the percentage of persons who would be considered white in California? Well, it's 35%. it shows you actually that assisted suicide is really quite a class issue in a sense. And I'm not suggesting that I'm not concerned about people who are Black or Hispanic or Asian. I'm not suggesting that at all. But the data is quite pronounced when you look at the California data. It shows you clearly that there's a small group of people who actually want this. That this is not about everybody in the culture wanting to die by assisted suicide, and we just have to provide them this freedom, this choice, and this autonomy, that it is actually a smaller group of people who seem to want this. So the issues of assisted suicide by the residency requirement being removed. So you have the case Gideon versus Brown in Oregon, which claimed that Oregon's assisted suicide residency requirement was unconstitutional because it denied health care, look at the word, health care, to someone based on residency. So the argument was assisted suicide is another form of healthcare, another healthcare, option in Oregon, and to deny a healthcare option to someone based on their residency was unconstitutional. Now, if we're not talking about healthcare, and first of all, assisted suicide is not healthcare. There's nothing.
Moreover, it's never been legally defined as such.
No, but certain states are using this language, and this is the problem.
They use the language, but they use the language informally, and that's really not based. They're trying to create a
Correct.
fait accompli.
Right, they're trying to create a runaround. That's correct. For instance, if you guys don't like how my face looks, so I decide I'm going to get some cosmetic surgery. Cosmetic surgery is not defined as healthcare. Doctors will do it, but it's not defined as healthcare. Assisted suicide should never be defined as healthcare. There's nothing healthcare-ish about it, even if doctors do it, okay? Nonetheless, the Oregon government didn't defend their law. Instead, what they did is they changed their law. Okay, so the case never went to court. In August 2022, Compassionate Choices launched the court case challenging the Vermont assisted suicide residency requirement. And then they had another case they launched in New Jersey. The difference with New Jersey was, so Vermont also just capitulated and amended their law to allow non-residents to die by assisted suicide in Vermont. So what you have is a situation where the case in New Jersey is different because the New Jersey state government actually defended their residency requirement. So Oregon and Vermont have removed their residency requirements. So what they're saying is that they've made it a national issue in a sense, because anybody in the US, and actually probably Canadians, possibly anybody in the world, could go to Oregon and Vermont and die by assisted suicide. Okay, here we go. The removal of the residency requirement means that every American is able to die by assisted suicide, which is of course the goal of Compassionate Choices. Now, the other concern is this issue of telehealth, because there's been a big push on telehealth. If you look at Vermont added telehealth as a way of approval of assisted suicide in their state. With the use of telehealth, anyone in America could be approved by assisted suicide remotely and then go to Oregon or Vermont to die. So they make it quite easy that way. And I don't want to joke about this one-way trip to Oregon, but you know what I'm getting to. Oregon has an assisted suicide death center operated by Dr. Gideon. In 2023, there were 23 out-of-state assisted suicide deaths in Oregon. Now, you saw me talk about the West Virginia Amendment 1. Now, the reason Pat McGeehan got involved with this question of assisted suicide and got Amendment 1 passed was because he had a constituent who had contacted him wanting him to bring forward an assisted suicide bill in West Virginia. And the reason is that resident of his region wanted to die by assisted suicide, ended up going to Oregon and dying by assisted suicide in Oregon as one of the out-of-state deaths. So it's very important how you see this. It was that whole experience. So Pat McGeehan kept in contact with this resident, this man. He kept in contact with him and actually communicated with him the day of his death. But that's what motivated him. You're wondering what motivates someone to do what he did in order to get this whole thing blocked completely in West Virginia. It was his experience with an out-of-state assisted suicide death. So let's talk about this whole other issue, the redefinitions. Now, this is a more controversial one in a sense, but you see where they're going. So Dr. Jennifer Guardiani, and I may have pronounced that wrong, in Colorado. She had an article published by the Colorado Sun talking about the assisted suicide deaths of at least 3 people. She also did a study on this, which was co-published by one of those people who died by assisted suicide, where anorexia nervosa was the reason for their approval for assisted suicide. So what she was doing is redefining anorexia nervosa, which is considered a chronic condition, and she was considering it a terminal condition. So by calling it a terminal condition, therefore, she was approving their assisted suicide deaths. Now, we know that there was at least 1 death by assisted suicide in Oregon in 2021 for anorexia. So a recent study that was done shows that at least 60 cases of assisted suicide by anorexia. Now, those were documented cases, so you have to understand there might have been many, many more. So the whole study looked at the ones that were documented. So you have a couple cases that have been documented in Canada. You've got cases that were documented in the Netherlands, Belgium, etc. And in those documented cases, they were able to come up with 60 cases. As I say, there could be many, many, many more, because assisted suicide data and euthanasia data, not all of it, of course, is documented by the case. Anyway, and it shows that all of those 60 cases were women, every single one of them. Now, anorexia tends to be more prevalent to women, but men do get anorexia, do have eating disorder issues, absolutely. But all of those 60 cases were women. So it makes it very interesting because, of course, anorexia is not a terminal condition. It's a chronic condition. I could do a whole talk on that. You might have heard Chelsea Roff speak about this. She's certainly an expert, and she makes it very clear this is actually a threat to people with anorexia. So the assisted suicide lobby started lethal drug experiments, and I think this has been a very important point. It's been talked about more and more recently, but it's still been an under-discussed issue, is how do they do assisted suicide? So I was recently in, as I say, the legislature in Britain, in Westminster, speaking, and one of the members who showed up had voted yes to assisted suicide. Had voted yes to assisted suicide. So he's at my event. He had voted yes to assisted suicide. And he said to me, "Oh, I've got 10 minutes." So I had made a longer presentation for those who came. I waited a few minutes when they came in. And then this guy comes in, and I had already finished my presentation, or I was nearly finished. He says, "I've got 10 minutes. I got another meeting I have to go to." So I went through some basic information about what's going on in the US, because that was my topic, because the UK bill, the British bill, is far closer to a US bill than it is to a Canadian bill, even though there's overtures of that language of that bill, which would be somewhat similar to Canada. Anyway, and then what really hit him was this whole thing about how assisted suicide is done. You should have seen the look on his face when I started explaining. I said, the lethal drug experiments have known side effects. So they started doing these experiments in order to find a cheaper way to do assisted suicide in the US. So you can actually see that clearly when you look at the Oregon data. They have a graph showing the use of the different drug cocktails and how they started with this drug cocktail, then it moved to that one and that one and that one and so forth. Just so you know, last year, the longest time of death was 137 hours for, 2023. I don't have 2024 data. 2023, the longest time of death in Oregon was 137 hours. So the first second alternative was reported in Seattle Times as being too harsh, burning patients' mouths and throats, causing some to scream in pain. The second drug mixture after that led to deaths that stretched out hours. Now, remember, I'm quoting the Seattle Times. It says up to 31 hours in one case. We know that in 2023, there was a case of 137 hours. If you look at the Oregon data from the previous years, it always used that number of 104 hours had been the longest time of death in the previous reports. So you see what they're doing. They're experimenting to find an inexpensive way to kill you. The Atlantic published in January 2019 an article stated an advocacy organization called End of Life Washington briefly advised prescribing a drug mixture with the sedative chlorohydrate to about 70 patients. And Robert Wood, the medical director of the organization, I always ask, why does an assisted suicide group actually need a medical director? I don't know. They're both killing people, so I don't know why they need a medical director. But anyway, he had said, "We know this is going to put you to sleep, and we're pretty sure it's going to kill you." It worked with some tragic catch. In a few cases, the chlorohydrate burned people's throats, causing severe pain just as the time they expected relief. Medical Express reported September 8, 2020, a little known secret not publicized by advocates of aid in dying was that while most deaths were speedy, others were very slow. Some lingered for 6 or 9 hours, a few more than 3 days. As I say, 2023, 137 hours. Assisted suicide is clearly not what it appears to be. I think we don't talk about this enough. Many people support assisted suicide. What? Based on fear of dying. We're all human. We all have a fear of dying a bad death. Let's be brutally honest. We all want to avoid suffering. And I have no question about that. I do not want to suffer. But assisted suicide can also be a bad death. The way to undermine some of their talking points is simply to talk about how they do this. And we seem to avoid that too often, I think. I'm going to mention a little bit about Canada, not just because Gordon's here, but I think it's to show you where things are going. Health Canada 2023 data said 15,343 reported euthanasia deaths. Of course, I used the word reported because I'm assuming, and based on the Quebec data, I'm probably correct, that there's some underreporting in Canada. And you see that's gone up every year. I'm estimating that in 2024, we had 16,500. Where do I get that data from? Well, I've got the Ontario data, I've got the Quebec data, I've got the Alberta data. They represent 75% of the Canadian population, and it's showing about a 7.5% increase in the number of deaths. So that would put us somewhere around 16,500. It might be whatever, a little bit off, but not too much. Quebec had the highest euthanasia rate in the world in 2024, 6,058. You have to understand that Quebec only represents about 22% or 23% in that range of the Canadian population. They have a huge number of euthanasia deaths. It's actually very, very sad to see. Gordon lives in Quebec, so we have to be very concerned about him. But you know, the Quebec population is very different on these issues. Quebec has had Canada's had euthanasia veterans with PTSD, euthanasia based on homelessness, poverty, disability, and much more. The whole concept of euthanasia. Now, remember, you don't have to be terminally ill to die by euthanasia in Canada. There's no 6-month provision or anything like that. Recent report from the Ontario Coroner's Office. They have a committee that looks at these deaths, and the report came out and it looked at all the deaths between 2018 and December 31st, 2023. It concluded that there was 428 non-compliant euthanasia deaths in Ontario in that time frame. Non-compliance did vary. There were several cases which were extreme. There were other cases that were, simply the doctor didn't get a second signature on the report. So the law requires a second signature. 25% of the euthanasia doctors who had done at least one euthanasia had at least one non-compliant death. So you can start doing your math. There was quite a few doctors in Ontario who have done a lot of euthanasia, though, an awful lot. I live in London, Ontario. We have a doctor here in London, Ontario that actually had the most non-compliant deaths. The report doesn't say that, but I was told that very clearly, that who that one doctor was, and I'm not going to get into that. Dr. Ellen Weeb runs a euthanasia clinic in Vancouver. In October, a judge approved an injunction to prevent a death, just to prevent Weeb from killing a woman who did not have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. That's how we define it in Canada, grievous and irremediable medical condition. In December, the family of that woman launched a wrongful death. In December, a family launched a wrongful death lawsuit against Dr. Weeb for the death of a 52-year-old man that was the husband, father of this family, who died by euthanasia while he was on a psychiatric day pass. I always emphasize that one of the ways to fight this is to call it what it is. I don't think we should be using other terms. I think we need to call it what it is. It's assisted suicide. It is about killing. It is about assisting that killing. It's directly being involved with causing death. We oppose assisted suicide because these laws allow one person, usually a physician, but almost all these laws are now going to be expanded pretty soon by the end of this year to include physician's assistants or nurse practitioners, etc., to be directly involved with causing the death of another person. I personally oppose killing people, but why is assisted suicide so wrong? It allows one person in law or a group of people in law to kill other people. And I don't think there's anything safe about this. And yes, there are groups of people who are far more vulnerable than others, but we are all vulnerable. I think creating exceptions to homicide, because that's what Canada did. Canada created an exception to homicide, or manslaughter. Manslaughter would be more of a British definition of the law. Allowing assisting of a suicide, that these are seriously bad ideas. The law exists to protect me even in my time of need, and sometimes even to protect me from you. That's what the law is there to do. We don't need a new strategy. I don't believe we need a new strategy at all. What we need to do is be clear. What is assisted suicide? What is this about? How does this work? What are they doing? We need to be very clear about this. We need to be willing to say it. We need to be the canaries in the coal mine. They say it's about my body, my choice. That's what the assisted suicide lobby says. They say it's autonomy, it's freedom, it's choice. This is a lie. It's not about autonomy. It's not about freedom. It's not about choice. That's not what it is. There are some radical autonomists out there. That's true. They want their freedom. They want to say, I want to do what I want to do. I have the right to. But remember, they're asking somebody else to be involved with the act. So that's a radical concept if you think about it. Autonomy is what I do with myself, you know? And I give the example, somebody trying to jump off a bridge because they wanted to die by suicide. That's a different act than me coming and helping them over the bridge. It's a different act. It's not an autonomous act when somebody else is directly involved with approving it, telling them, yes, your life is not worth living, prescribing you a lethal poison cocktail. Many of the people requesting assisted suicide have issues related to capacity. They have issues related to hopelessness, despair, and alienation. Some of them have cognitive distortions. They're going through a difficult time. We all acknowledge that they're going through a difficult time. Assisted suicide is more about abandonment. It's about abandonment, not about autonomy. We're medically abandoning these people. Why do people ask for assisted suicide? This is the fundamental question. You know, as I say, there are some radical autonomists out there. They're demanding their right to die. When you see an article in a newspaper about someone who's they're using as the story in order to push to legalize assisted suicide in Nevada or in Delaware, you've seen these stories. Many of these people are radical autonomists, and they want their story in the news because they want to know that it's my freedom, it's my choice. They're out there like that. There are some people like that. Obviously, there are. There are some people who are suffering. I agree. And I don't want you to suffer. I have no wish for you to suffer. I would rather we have proper care for you. Most people die by assisted suicide because they're going through a difficult health condition. That's correct. It's a difficult time for them. They might be terminal. They might not be terminal. They might have a terminal condition. Remember, there's a difference between having a terminal condition and actually being terminal. They feel depressed, lonely. They're experiencing feelings of hopelessness, despair. They believe their life has lost meaning, purpose, or value. I've had several phone calls from people who have been approved for euthanasia in Canada because we have a helpline. And I've been talking to these people, and you think that they're asking for death because they are suffering greatly. And I always talk about this call I got from this guy in British Columbia. He had multiple health conditions, and he was telling me about all these health conditions. And my first reaction was, I don't think you've received the care you deserve. That was my first reaction. But, you know, and I have to be very clear, when you're getting a call like this, remember, you don't know who this person is. They don't know who you are. So you spend a lot of time listening. You spend a lot of time finding out who they are. You spend a lot of time trying to create some connection because obviously they're calling you. You want to know something about the person you're talking to. You want to make a connection. But in the end, my question to them is always the same thing. But why do you want your doctor to kill you? Because that's what you're actually asking your doctor or nurse practitioner to do. And the answer I got from this guy in BC after he went through his multiplicity of health problems, like, I mean, my heart went out to him. Like, I'm not a person who doesn't have compassion. But his response was not, oh, Alex, I'm suffering so great, I can't live like this any longer. His response was, I have nobody in my life. I have nobody in my life. I feel there's no purpose for my living. That's what he responded to me with. It wasn't that, oh, I'm suffering so greatly, not to say he isn't suffering, but I have nobody in my life. That's what he said. And I think we have to take this. This is not the only time I've been told this. It's not the only time. And it's common. Legalizing assisted suicide is not about their freedom. There's no freedom in being killed. It's not about autonomy. When the doctor says, I agree, your life's not worth living, I will give you this lethal poison. It is about abandonment, though. We are abandoning these people. And it does threaten my life. And it threatens your life because you're human. You know, the funny thing about all this, we in the modern day forget what it means to be human. We think of ourselves as creatures who are, you know, strongly able to make decisions for ourselves all the time. You know, we're powerful people. You know, don't tell me what to do. But the reality is, a human being, you know, we go through difficulties. When we go through illness, it affects all of us. It affects all of what it is to be human. It affects me, emotionally and psychologically. It affects me spiritually. It affects me in every way when I am sick and going through difficult times, right? And then if you add loneliness to the question, you add the question of one who becomes depressed, one who's going through existential distress. When you add all this into it, you realize that these people are most often is that they're losing hope. Suffering alone, this has become common. Loneliness, isolation, depression, loss of hope, purpose. These are the leading reasons why people are asking to die. And these are feelings that we all, and realities that we all experience. None of us are immune to that. And it is 3 o'clock, so we're coming to an end. And there's my information. So the reaction to actually ending assisted suicide or ending the concept of this is recognizing that we've lost what we absolutely need as human beings. As human beings, we require a caring culture. We require a culture that cares for people and doesn't kill them. And I'm not sure what this is all going to take, but we need culture shift in a massive way. So Denise has her hand up, and I'm going to let her go first then. So you can unmute yourself, Denise, and ask a question, and I'm happy to answer it.
Sure. In all these states where assisted suicide is legal, and I'm not sure how it is in Canada either, have the laws changed as far as what goes on the death certificate? Because I know at one time they were just putting the underlying illness as the cause of death.
Okay, all these states pretty much require that the underlying illness is the cause of death that goes on the death certificate. I'm not, obviously, Oklahoma passed a bill, but Oklahoma doesn't have assisted suicide. They passed that death certificate accuracy law. Right now in Connecticut, even though Connecticut, we're very fortunate, Connecticut's never legalized assisted suicide, even though the assisted suicide lobby's pushed very hard in Connecticut to get it legal. What you see is that they right now have a bill, which is also a death certificate accuracy law. And I think that might have something to do with Stephen Mendelsohn's actions. I'm not sure. But the fact of it is that at least keeps things accurate, where you have to have your death certificate being accurate. So right now, this is what's going on. Have to leave. Okay, that's fine. That's very good. Okay. So any other questions?
Well, I have a question. It's about, is it true that in many cases it looks like the receiver of the poison become suffocated, lose their breath, the lungs are filled with liquid. Is it true?
Okay, so how assisted suicide is done is a very important point. And the drugs that they're used for assisted suicide is the question. So Dr. Joel Zivit is the one who has made this whole issue, this concern an issue, because he's looked at the autopsies of people who have died by lethal drugs in the case of capital punishment. Now, in the case of capital punishment, they always do an autopsy afterwards. Whereas in the case of assisted suicide, it's rare to get an autopsy afterwards. It's very rare. In the case of euthanasia in Canada, there's almost no autopsies after euthanasia. It'd be very, very, very few and far between, unless they had some sort of medical condition that they just couldn't assess. I'll give you an example quickly. Anyway, my point of it is Joel Zivit made it very clear that when you looked at the data from the autopsies, that these people had pulmonary edema. They had very heavy, heavy, heavy lungs. Their lungs had filled with fluid. So in fact, they had died by their lungs filling with fluid. It was similar then to a death by drowning. Now here's the fact about assisted suicide. They give you a drug system to put you into coma, and another drug to put you into paralysis, and a third drug that's mixed in. Like they have all these different drugs mixed into this cocktail. The third point is that they make sure that the other drug causes your death. The lungs stop breathing is what happens. Now, okay, if you think about the death, it took 137 hours. I'm assuming that in that case, because it's assisted suicide, that the person had their lethal drugs mixed up with whatever it was. I have no idea. And they did not swallow the whole amount, meaning that they passed out, went into coma before they had completed the full drug mixture into their system. Either that or they had a very poor circulatory system, because when people are nearing death, often their whole circulatory system is shutting down. So things just aren't passing quickly to the body, etc. But you know, a 137-hour death is a very long time if you start thinking about it. And as I say, if you looked at the 2022 data, you would have seen that number 104 death. 104 hours was the longest time of death. It's a very long period of time to die. And if you consider how these drugs work, this is the thing. Now, in the case of euthanasia, it's a little different. Now, why is it a little different? Because the doctor has to be present at the death when you are killed, because they're the ones doing the act. They are injecting you, or they're using an IV, hooking you up by IV. So the Canadian situation is a little different, where the doctor who is doing the death receives what they call a double dose. So the package for euthanasia in Canada contains everything they need in it to kill you, and the drug mixture has the cocktail that you get a double dose of it. So if you haven't died within about 30 minutes, the doctor who's present at the death will then put the second amount into the IV, and obviously by that point you have enough poison in you to kill an elephant, and you're more likely to die. This is how it sort of works in my country. Not to say there's anything good about any of this. Gordon has his hand up.
Well, if I might, I'd like to back up Alex on this point of a small number of people causing this thing. You know, people get totally freaked out by the numbers in Quebec. Quebec, the French Canadians have a very, very low birth rate. They're very strong, I suppose, into what you call the suicide cult of Western civilization. Coincidentally, you have the Netherlands, the same thing. I think it's really Quebec and the Netherlands which have the lowest birth rate actually in the world right now, perhaps Japan.
Well, I don't think the Netherlands is lowest, but go on. Go ahead, yeah.
But in any case, what you can take away from positive from this is that Quebec is the absolute worst case, and they have a 7.7% rate of death by euthanasia. And they have, for cancer, they have up to 17% and an average of 14%. So all of this looks like a terrible number of deaths, and it is in an absolute sense. But statistically, you see that even at the highest rate in the worst case of cancer, where they're doing the marketing the most efficiently for euthanasia, you still have 83% of the people who refuse euthanasia. And that's in Quebec, which is the worst case in the entire world. So basically, it's completely illegitimate to pretend that people want this thing. People don't want this thing. It's radical. Well, what is it? It's our culture, but it's radical Malthusian concept that there's too many people in the world and that any dead human is a good human. So euthanasia is heavily, heavily funded by the people who think like that. And Alex also mentioned the difference between when it's medical care and when it's not medical care. The point is the ability to market it, you see, in all of the things about difficulty in life and so on and so forth, they all factor in up to a certain point, and Oregon is showing approximately how strong that can be. But Oregon still has a rate which is just a little bit more than half. I mean, not a half, a little bit more than a tenth of what we see in Quebec. And so what is the difference? The difference is that in Quebec, euthanasia is systematically marketed by all of the medical professions and all of the institutions. And to give you just an idea of the effectiveness of that, in their statistics and their breakdown by regions, okay, then you see that you have half the rate in Quebec City that you have in Montreal, and that's because Montreal is a metropolis and it has all kinds of other races and all kinds of other cultures. In Quebec City, they only have French Canadians. So there you see the rate is twice that in Montreal. But then if you go out into the sticks, into the real deep French Canadian area, you have something called the Bas de Fleuve, which is the lower St. Lawrence River. And they have the highest rate in the entire province. And on the other side of the river, literally on the other side of the river, something called the Côte Nord, the North Shore. The same population, same characteristics. They make their livings the same way. They have half the rate of what's happening in the Bas de Fleuve. And what could possibly be the reason for that? It's the marketing. It's the precision of marketing of the doctors who are involved. You come onto a helpless patient and you say, you should kill yourself because your prognosis is awful. And a lot of people do it. But again, the important point, even under those circumstances, they never get above 20%, which is just extraordinary when you think about it.
So we have a question from Stephen McCotrick, so we should probably give him a chance.
Yep.
And then we can, yes, Stephen, go ahead.
Alex, do you or anybody who is on the call know of any initiative to, in the United States, to block the interstate shipment of lethal medication prescribed out of state?
Well, that is something that needs to be worked on, especially with the new HHS staff, etc. But the fact of it is I'm not sure where that would be at right now. The biggest thing to me that has to happen is one of the whole thing of blocking the shipping, because right as of this moment, Oregon makes it quite clear that if you want to die by assisted suicide, you have to come to Oregon to die. So as of this moment, it isn't. When I don't know of an issue of people dying in another state, but receiving their drugs from Oregon or from Vermont. So I don't know if that is being an issue yet, but that will become an issue because the assisted suicide lobby wants that to be an issue. They want to be able to ship the drugs to you and you die that way. So that's what they want. So
and particularly into a state that doesn't permit assisted suicide.
Correct. For instance, Florida is a massive state, and yet they do not permit assisted suicide, or Texas is a massive state, and yet they do not permit assisted suicide. So if they allow the shipping of these drugs, you could see how you would have a huge number of people dying by assisted suicide from out of state. At the moment, they haven't had that issue yet happening, but I agree this has to be a primary concern. The prevention of the shipping of these drugs from state to state is of primary importance. I pointed out healthcare on purpose also. I think that what has to happen in the US is you have to, HHS, for instance, and other states, they need to specifically define what constitutes healthcare. If you don't do that, you're going to have a problem, because the assisted suicide lobby is absolutely in all their legislation pushing that they want this to become healthcare. If this is healthcare, then suddenly it becomes something we have to offer you, Stephen.
Well,
you come
also
in.
HIPAA would apply too, as you'd get all the
right. If it's defined as healthcare, that's right. So, but the thing of it is there's nothing healthcare about it, and you can see how dangerous that is. But that's where their goal is. And it has to be stopped.
If you're changing from a criminal act to a permitted act, it seems to me a state couldn't condition anything it wants on its performance. So, for example, I always thought, I've never heard this argument, but I always thought one of the arguments against having objective observers, if there are any such, at the time of death was that they wanted to preserve the medical quality of the act. And I think the response is, well, wait a second, if you're asking a legislature to decriminalize this, it's already a crime, then they can put whatever conditions they want on it, including an objective observer at the time the medication is administered.
Yeah. So I think John Kelly had a question. Is John Kelly able to ask his question?
Yes. Alex, you mentioned euthanasia a few times. Could you flesh that out for us?
Right. So euthanasia differs from assisted suicide, not in the drugs used, not in the intention, but in who carries it out. So in the case of euthanasia, that's why the whole thing about the IV issue in California comes out, because euthanasia is done by the person to you. So in the case of Canada's euthanasia law, they do it by IV or by injection, but it's usually done by IV because it's cleaner. And then what happens is the doctor's actually putting that in, they are carrying out the act, and you're dying. Whereas with assisted suicide, you have to carry out the act yourself. So you see the difference. So if they're going to use IV drugs in California and call it assisted suicide, they have to have a system where you push a button and then the drugs would then flow into you, but it's been pre-set up. even then the whole act starts becoming indistinguishable from euthanasia. Now remember, euthanasia is a homicide, because whether I kill you by lethal drugs, whether I kill you by a gun, whether I put a pillar over your head, I'm actually doing it to you. That's a homicide, right? Whereas assisted suicide, technically you have to do to yourself. So they're prescribing to you those lethal poisons and you have to take it yourself. So you see the difference right there in how it's carried out, not in the type of drug used or the intention, because in both cases the intention is your death, and in both cases the drugs used are designed to kill you. And they're actually very similar. They do differ a little bit because of regulations. You also have a problem in the US. It's just a reality. Certain drugs you can't get in the US because you have states that allow for capital punishment. Canada doesn't allow for capital punishments. We're able to get those drugs here. It's just a crazy reality at what we live in this country, and in any country, that companies would ship drugs to your country for euthanasia, but they won't ship. Like, it all doesn't make sense. It's all about killing to me. I'm opposed to all of capital punishment and euthanasia. I don't believe we should be killing people. Do you have any more questions, John?
Do you, I thought you implied that assisted suicide in other states can lead to euthanasia in specific cases. Is that true, or everything is still assisted?
Well, actually, you wouldn't know, would you, John? Because there's no oversight of the law. It's impossible to know. Because there's no oversight of the law, if you were to die by someone actually doing the act to you, that would be a euthanasia then, right? How would we know? So you've been prescribed, as an example, the lethal poison. You have that by your bedside, and you decide tomorrow to have that administered to you, but you found it's easier to have someone to do it to you than for you to do it to yourself. That would be euthanasia when they do it to you. So you get hooked up by an IV, it gets put into your system in that way, and then you see what I'm getting to. How would you know the difference if you don't have any oversight of the law? There's no oversight of the law. So how would you know? The other thing is, one leads to the other for another reason, and that is that I don't think there's anything good about euthanasia or assisted suicide, but I do recognize that euthanasia is a more effective way to kill for two reasons. One, the doctor or nurse practitioner is at your bedside. So obviously speaking, there's no problem of only half of the drug being consumed before you actually went into coma. There's no problem because they're putting it into you, right? But secondly, if you didn't die, so with assisted suicide, let's say you didn't die and you're laying there for 6 hours, 9 hours, 12 hours. Well, technically we can't do anything to you, right? Because it's self-administered. But with euthanasia, they could just give you another dose. So I'm not saying there's anything good about any of this, because there isn't. It's all about killing. But you can see how euthanasia is, sadly, it's in any way, you can't argue it's not a more effective way to kill. And killing is the outcome. That's what their goal is.
And again, the healthcare aspect, okay, why they want to call it medical aid in dying is because if you have an infection, you can take a pill for your antibiotic, or they can give you a shot for the antibiotic, and it depends on which is more useful to them, you see. So basically, if they get the idea of medical aid in dying, then you'll have somebody, well, I can't do it because I don't have the physical capacity to do it. Okay, we'll do it to you because you don't have the physical capacity. Right. Then somebody else raises his hand and says, yes, but it's not fair for you to do it for them and not for me. And on and on and on it goes. And the idea being that eventually you have the doctor as a agent of the state killing their citizens. And this in the United States have a tendency to think that, oh, it's not going to come to that. But one of the hottest political buttons in the United States is universal health care.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
And if you get universal health care, boom, you just went over the cliff.
But John, you remember the Shavelson case in California, where Shavelson was trying to, he was challenging the law, saying that in certain cases it's too difficult for someone to self-administer. Therefore, in those cases, only those cases, we need a situation where the person can have it administered to them, which would be euthanasia, which would be homicide. And the judge said in that case, which was absolutely correct, that this was not actually an extension of the law or the changing of the law. It would be passing a new law. He was correct, because this would be then allowing for euthanasia, which is a homicide. It's not the same as an assisted suicide if you consider the legality of the question, which is exactly what I argued. I said, I sent in saying, this is not an extension of the law. This is a changing of the law. If you do that, this is allowing for, it would be the court allowing for euthanasia, which would be a change of the law. And the judge agreed with that question, saying, no, we can't allow that, because it would actually change the law, not just expand it. You can see that quite clearly, that's what it'd be. And you can see what Shavelson was trying to do. He's trying to get the thin edge of the wedge. You get that little bit in, and of course, it's like the letting the camel's nose into the tent. Before you know it, the camel's in the tent. That's exactly what Shavelson was trying to do. And they know that the Americans are more cautious than Canadians on this sort of question. So I don't know if California is going to buy into this extension in their law or not. We'll see what happens. But if they do, that would be a massive change, not just a little change, because if they pass the amendment to their law this year, that allows for it to be done by IV, because suddenly it becomes indistinguishable from euthanasia. How would you know it was euthanasia or assisted suicide? How would you know? You wouldn't know. It's not possible to know. The act is identical. So
if you want to know how lucky people are in the United States with regards to democracy, look at Canada, our social democracy. We just changed our head of state. Okay, our head of state has been changed, has all the powers of an American president, and he has never been elected to any public office. And he is in, because his party chose him as their leader, he automatically becomes our prime minister. Imagine the democratic deficit we have in this place.